All right. Silence. Some say it's golden, others say it speaks volumes. We live in a world where we are surrounded by sounds and a constant stream of noise pollution, whether we're actively pursuing it or not. We're so surrounded by opinions and flippant words that there has to be active measures taken to distance ourselves in order to rest. But what happens when silence comes from someone we're hoping to hear from? We see a date when read timestamp on a text message, which only seems to fill us with a sense of anxiety. Are they ignoring me? Are they angry with me? Am I not important enough for them to take a couple seconds to reply? This feeling only increases when it comes from someone who claims to be all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good. What happens when the silence comes from God? In order to explore the silence of God, we will look at the what, the when, and the why. Firstly, what is meant by the silence of God? Second, why does his silence seem to come at the worst times? And third, what purpose could silence accomplish? The silence of God is the period in a Christian's life when God's presence isn't felt in a spiritual way. It's a time that is plagued with doubt, loneliness, and where one can get pestered by questions with no discernible answers. C.S. Lewis, after the death of his wife, wrote, "There are times in our spiritual lives when God is silent and seemingly absent. In some cases, this can be God's way of getting our attention about certain sins that we are blind to, but in others, the reason is not clear, and the experience of his silence can be disorienting and painful." For the purpose of our time, I'll be discussing the latter, the times when we are unable to feel God's presence with no explanation or understandable cause. While in the case of most, if not all modern Christians, direct or explicit spoken or physical contact with God isn't normal, there are periods of inexplicable spiritual closeness when things seem more clear. While these times are great in the moment, it makes the times of silence even more difficult, especially when it accompanies other trials. So why does God seem to leave his people in times of most need? The best way to answer this question is to see what God himself has to say about it. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God does not work based on our schedule or our idea of how things should be. C.S. Lewis seemed to have this in mind when writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. During a conversation regarding the Christ-like character of the lion Aslan, one character says, "Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you." In the same way, God isn't safe, and he doesn't bow to our every command. In fact, he very often doesn't give us the answers and outcomes we desire. A.W. Tozer wrote, "Left to ourselves, we tend to immediately reduce God to manageable terms. We want him where we can use him, or at least know where he is when we need him. We want a God we can in some way, some measure, control." So God will do what he will, but why is this? In order to understand what God's doing with the silence in our lives, I believe it's crucial to see what he's done in the past. The time spent on the ark was ended with a rainbow of hope for the future. The time in Egyptian slavery was ended with a leader rising up and leading an exodus. And finally, when Israel was seemingly inseparably dispersed, a Savior was given to bring every tribe, nation, race, and tongue into the world together for a common hope of unification and eternal satisfaction. The silence in these cases were preparing God's people for something greater than they could have ever imagined. On a more personal level, we look to Christ's suffering on and before the cross. my God, why have you forsaken me?" Not only is this a heart-wrenching glimpse into Jesus' feelings on the cross, but he's directly quoting a Psalm of David, showing his understanding of our feelings of suffering and abandonment. The beauty of referencing this psalm is it draws attention to its end. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. On you as I cast from my birth and from my mother's womb, you have been my God. If we're truly to understand the reason for suffering and for God to be silent, we must first admit that we see only a part of the bigger picture at work. This silent period may just be God readying us for what is to come, or as R.C. Sproul put it, when we go to the house of mourning, we go to an environment where our hearts can be equipped with transcendent wisdom. Furthermore, J.D. Greear takes this idea a step further and asserts, just because you feel that God is absent doesn't mean he actually is. Just because you can't track his footprints doesn't mean he's not walking beside you. If you are a believer, that feeling of being alone is always an illusion. Yes, always. God is always present, and despite the what, when, or why of the silence, we know that he is in complete control of every situation. All right, now I'm going to film you guys with proof that you're here.
Keeping our hand on.
All right.
And I